Why is the Chinese Communist Party afraid of democracy? Very good question. I will answer this question very seriously. What I said is not to emphasize which political system is better. I just want to answer this question directly and state my Chinese views. 1. What are the characteristics of Chinese people? In fact, China has a characteristic since modern times. No matter what doctrine or theory, it is essentially performance theory. In other words, it must be useful. A. Chinese people believe in a fact. Let me give you an example of China, which is a funny joke. In ancient times, when the weather was dry, ordinary people offered sacrifices to the Dragon King, God in charge of rain, for rain. If it rains a few days later, the people will be very happy. If it doesn't rain in a few days, people will scold the Dragon King immediately. It can be seen from this joke that no matter what god it is, as long as it is useful, the Chinese people will believe it. If it is useless, Chinese people will abandon it. Therefore, you can see all kinds of gods in China, including those responsible for students' study, health and longevity, rain, nursing home and cooking. So, do Chinese people really believe in these gods? No, the Chinese don't believe it at all. Religious people in Western countries serve God, while Chinese people let God serve Chinese people. Maybe many people with religious beliefs will feel uncomfortable with this sentence, but I didn't offend you. Chinese people really don't have religious beliefs. Many of my previous answers emphasize one thing, that is, Chinese people believe in results. B. Chinese people believe in themselves more. There are many stories of myths in ancient China. The biggest difference between the stories of myths in the West is that the stories of myths in China are all fighting against God and never giving in to God. These myths have a history of at least 3,000 years, so Chinese people have the spirit of fighting and believing in themselves in their genes. Let me give you an example. 1,000 years ago, there were floods everywhere, and people could not live. In China, a man named Yu led the people to drain the flood to the Yellow River and control the flooding. There is also a legend of flood in the West, which is the famous Noah's Ark. These are two myths that have been over thousands of years old. Maybe there was a big flood thousands of years ago, but the attitudes of the East and the West towards floods are different. There are many such myth stories in China. For example, once there were 10 suns in the sky, which was too hot to live. An archer named Hao Yi shot down 9 suns. For example, there was once a farmer who had 2 mountains blocking his way out of his house. He and his descendants dug mountains and moved them away. C. Chinese people are full of rebellious spirit, but the Chinese are also very easy to lead. There are countless peasant uprising wars in Chinese history. The earliest super-scale peasant uprising was in 209 BC. At that time, the slogan of Chinese farmers was "Will princes be born when you can't live? The emperors who were once high above can be killed by the humble peasants." To this day, one of the 4 famous works of Chinese literature, The Outlaws of the Marsh, tells the story of peasant uprising. Therefore, one of the genes that the Chinese people have in their genes for thousands of years is rebellion. At the same time, the Chinese people are very easy to lead. As long as they can live, have a place to live and have their own jobs, then the Chinese people will not rebel. Even if this job is very difficult, as long as they can hold on, they will not rebel. But once the Chinese people can't survive, they will immediately rebel on a large scale. What we want to express here is a cultural difference. That is, the Chinese people believe in themselves and don't believe in fate. Any fate that is unacceptable to the Chinese people will be overturned, whether it is God, nature or emperor. Therefore, the same is true in the political system. No matter what political system, the Chinese people pay more attention to whether it can make the Chinese people live a better life. If you can, then adopt it. If you can't, then abandon it. It's as simple as that. 2. Why didn't American democracy get the support of the Chinese people in China? Have Chinese people really never thought about using American democracy? China began to try to take the road of democracy at least 100 years ago. I believe China is one of the first countries to start thinking about its own political system and hope to take the road of democracy. In the year 1919, Chinese people tried to take the road of democracy. As a political system, Democracy must rely on its own economic foundation. To emphasize the political system without economic foundation is to deceive oneself. At that time, China's economy was very weak, and there was no possibility of development at all. At that time, what was most needed was a firm leadership to lead the Chinese people to achieve national independence. B. Is the reformed democracy really good? If democracy is a credit card, then the behavior of some countries is actually overdrafting democracy. At the end of the Cold War, it was the peak of American democracy. Almost all countries believe that American democracy is a good medicine to solve the problem of national governance. Russia has adopted a democratic system, but in the latter case, it seems not so good. After September 11, 2001, the United States set off a wave of American democracy all over the world. The main idea is, the people are suffering because the government is undemocratic. As long as American democracy is used, the people will immediately be the masters of the country. Quotation mark. After fighting the Taliban, some countries said that the dictatorship was over, and the leaders were elected by the people in the future. Let's wait for a better life. After fighting Iraq, the West said that the dictatorship was over, and the leaders were elected by the people in the future. Let's wait for a better life. The biggest challenge to American democracy is actually the Arab Spring. Almost all the Arab countries in which the Arab Spring appeared at that time were military dictatorships or centralized countries. No matter those who support or oppose American democracy, almost all of them admit that the military dictatorship or centralized system is relatively backward. Then after the change, all those countries should be better. When the Arab Spring broke out, China was very interested in American democracy. This is indeed the best opportunity to promote American democracy. As we all know, American democracy does not seem to bring stability and prosperity. C. What do Chinese people think of American democracy now? It is very simple. American democracy is very good, but it is not suitable for China. 3. Is the CPC afraid of democracy? To tell the truth, the CPC is not afraid. At present, there are millions of people traveling abroad and studying abroad every year in China. If the CPC is really afraid of American democracy, it should prohibit them from going abroad. On the contrary, the CPC constantly encourages people to travel abroad and Chinese students to study abroad, and most of the target countries are the United States. If the CPC is really worried, I think this behavior of the CPC is illogical. So what is the CPC's true attitude towards democracy? I think most people still don't believe it, but it's also true. The CPC's attitude towards democracy is learning. In fact, the person who knows you best in the world may not be your friend, but your enemy. Many countries have adopted democratic systems, but how deep do they know about democratic systems? China is different. As I said at the beginning, Chinese people attach great importance to practical results. Whether democracy is good or not, Chinese people must conduct in-depth research. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party is constantly making in-depth research on the American democratic system. For example, the modern state governance system is actually an important creation of American democracy. Simply speaking, this system weakens the management of the government, allowing more people and organizations to participate in the management, and the government only plays a guiding role. Now, the CPC is vigorously promoting and using it, and Xi Jinping personally signed it. Doesn't that sound ironic? As I have said many times, Chinese people are very concerned about the actual results. As long as it is useful, whether it is democratic or not, the Chinese will use it. If it doesn't work, whether it is democracy or not, the Chinese will abandon it. Many people may not agree with what I said today, and this answer is not for everyone to agree, but for the Chinese people to talk about their views. If you don't understand Chinese culture, you can't understand why Chinese people do things. Sometimes things look the same but have different roots. What some countries really confront may not be the Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese civilization. China is not actually a country in the eyes of Westerners. In fact, China is a civilization in the cloak of a country.